The silence in our home, a place I'd filled with warmth for 40 years, was the first thing that told me my life was over. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a heavy, deliberate quiet, thick with unspoken finality. Richard stood by the mahogany mantelpiece, the one I'd polished every Saturday morning, and he didn't look at me. He looked at a spot on the wall just over my shoulder, as if I were already a ghost in the life we had built together. My suitcase, a worn old thing we'd taken on our honeymoon to Niagara Falls, was standing by the front door. He had packed it himself. Inside, I knew, would be a selection of my most practical, uninteresting clothes, a dismissal in fabric and thread. He cleared his throat, a sound that seemed to echo in the cavernous quiet of the living room. "Eleanor," he began, his voice devoid of the affection it once held, "this isn't working. It hasn't been for a while." He was lying, of course. It had been working perfectly for him just last month, when my salary from the university library was paying for his new set of golf clubs and the extravagant dinner parties he so loved to host. But last month, I still had a job. 2 weeks ago, after 35 years of loyal service, my position as head archivist was made redundant. Digitization, they'd called it. A cold, sterile word for a cold, sterile ending. I was replaced by a server humming in a climate-controlled room. I looked at Richard, truly looked at him for the first time in what felt like years. The man I had married, the boy with the hopeful eyes and the easy laugh, was gone. In his place stood a stranger, his face a mask of strained politeness, his posture stiff with a discomfort that wasn't for me, but for himself. He was embarrassed by this messy human situation. He was embarrassed by me. A man my age in my position, he continued, finally meeting my gaze with a flicker of steel, needs a partner who is contributing, not a liability. The word hung in the air between us, ugly and sharp. Liability. After 40 years of partnership, of raising our daughter, of nursing him through illnesses and celebrating his promotions, of managing a home and a full-time career, I had been reduced to a single word on a balance sheet, and the numbers in his mind no longer added up. I didn't cry. The shock was a cold, solid thing in my chest, leaving no room for tears. I thought of the thousands of tiny sacrifices I had made over the decades, the small accommodations of the soul that every wife makes. I'd given up my love for painting because he found the smell of turpentine unpleasant. I'd stopped going on long, solitary walks in the woods because he felt it was unsociable. I had tailored my dreams to fit the shape of his ambitions. And now the garment of our life together was being torn away, and I was left with nothing. Or so he believed. I walked towards the door, my feet feeling like lead on the Persian rug we had bought in a moment of shared joy 20 years ago. My hand closed around the cool brass of the doorknob. I didn't look back. I couldn't bear to see the relief I knew would be spreading across his face. As I pulled the heavy oak door closed behind me, the soft click of the latch sounded like a final, definitive gunshot to the heart of my past. The life I had known was officially over. I was 59 years old, jobless, and standing on the porch of the only home I'd ever known, with a single poorly packed suitcase and a future that was a terrifying blank void. He thought he was casting out a burden. He had no idea that he was setting a prisoner free. And he had absolutely no clue that this prisoner was hiding a fortune he couldn't even begin to comprehend, a secret world I had nurtured in the shadows of his ego for more than a decade. The rain began to fall then, cold and steady, washing over the quiet suburban street in Maple Creek, Vermont. It felt like the world was weeping for me, because I still couldn't find the tears to do it myself. The first night was the hardest. The rhythmic squeak of the ceiling fan in the dingy motel room on the edge of town was a poor substitute for the familiar hum of the refrigerator and the gentle creaks of our old house. Every sound was alien, every shadow was menacing. I lay on top of the scratchy polyester bedspread, still in my day clothes, and stared at the water-stained ceiling. The smell of stale cigarette smoke and bleach clung to the air, a scent so far removed from the lavender and old books of my former life that it felt like I had been transported to another planet. Richard's words echoed in my mind, a cruel mantra of rejection. Liability, not contributing. The phrases circled and circled, stripping away my sense of self-worth with each rotation. For 40 years, I had been Mrs. Eleanor Vance. I was Richard's wife, a mother, the university archivist. My identity was a house of cards built on these roles, and he had just blown it all down with a single careless breath. Who was I now? Just a woman in a motel room with a few $100s in her purse and a profound bone-deep ache of betrayal. I thought about our daughter Sarah, who lived across the country in California. I could call her, of course. She would be horrified, and she would insist I fly out immediately. But the shame was a physical barrier. How could I explain to my successful, vibrant daughter that her father had thrown me out like yesterday's newspaper simply because my paycheck had stopped? The humiliation was too great to bear. No, this was a battle I had to face alone. Sometime around 3 a.m, when the darkness was at its most absolute, a different thought began to push through the fog of despair. It was a small, defiant spark. It was the thought of Eliza Bloom. Eliza was my secret. She was my pen name. For the last 12 years, while Richard was at his golf club or his business dinners, I had been writing. It started as a small hobby, a way to channel the creativity he had so casually discouraged. I wrote children's stories, whimsical tales of brave little animals in magical forests, inspired by the bedtime stories I used to invent for Sarah. On a whim, I sent one to a small publisher. I never expected to hear back, but I did. They loved it. That first small advance check felt like stolen treasure. I opened a separate bank account under my maiden name, a secret place to deposit the earnings from my silly little hobby, as Richard would have undoubtedly called it had he known. Over the years, Eliza Bloom became quietly successful. Her books sold well, translated into a dozen languages. The advances grew larger, the royalty statements more astonishing. While Eleanor Vance was meticulously cataloging historical documents for a modest salary, Eliza Bloom was building a fortress of financial independence, brick by digital brick, in an account Richard knew nothing about. He managed our joint finances with an iron fist, always lamenting how little I contributed, never once suspecting that my private earnings were slowly dwarfing his own impressive income. I never touched the money. It wasn't for spending. It was for me. It was proof that a part of my soul, the part he couldn't see or value, was not just alive, but thriving. Lying there in that grim motel room, the thought of Eliza's bank account was like a lighthouse in a storm. It was more than money. It was validation. It was a decade of secret work, of whispered stories typed late at night, of a life lived entirely on my own terms. The next morning, I walked to a small community bank in the next town over. With trembling hands, I used my laptop app at a public library to transfer a substantial amount from Eliza's account into a new one I had just opened. Seeing the numbers materialize on the screen, solid and real, felt like taking my first breath after nearly drowning. This wasn't Richard's money. This wasn't our money. This was my money, earned by my talent, my imagination, my discipline. With that single act, a shift occurred within me. The despair didn't vanish, but it loosened its grip. It was replaced by a cold, quiet anger. An anger at myself for having become so small, for having allowed my worth to be defined by a man who saw me only as an accessory to his own life. I checked out of the motel and drove. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I was moving forward, away from the ghost of Eleanor Vance. I drove for hours through winding Vermont roads, past rolling green hills and quaint little towns. The world outside the car window seemed vibrant, alive, and for the first time in 2 weeks, I felt a flicker of hope that I could be too. I ended up in a small town called Oak Haven, a place I'd only ever passed through. On its little main street, I saw a small apartment for rent above a quiet bookstore. It seemed like a sign. I paid 3 months' rent in cash that day, using the money Eliza had earned. That night, I slept in my own space, on a mattress on the floor, surrounded by unpacked boxes. It was nothing like the grand house I had left, but it was mine. All mine. And in the silence of that empty apartment, I didn't feel like a liability. I felt the first fragile stirrings of freedom. The first few weeks in Oak Haven were a blur of quiet adjustment. I bought a few pieces of secondhand furniture, a comfortable armchair, a sturdy wooden table to write on, and a soft rug that felt warm under my feet. The apartment, with its slanted ceilings and view of the town square, began to feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a nascent home. I spent my days walking, rediscovering the simple pleasure of moving at my own pace, with no destination in mind. I explored the bookstore downstairs, breathing in the familiar, comforting scent of paper and ink. I sat in the town's only cafe, sipping tea and watching people go by, feeling anonymous and strangely peaceful. I was untethered from my old life, and while it was frightening, it was also liberating. One afternoon, while unpacking a box of old personal effects I'd stored in the attic back in Maple Creek, a box Richard had clearly missed in his haste to evict me, I found an old address book. My fingers traced over the faded names, ghosts of friendships I had let wither over the years, mostly because Richard had found them unsuitable. One name stood out, Clara Bellwether. Clara had been my best friend in college, a whirlwind of paint-splattered clothes, loud laughter, and radical ideas. Richard had despised her. He called her flighty, unrefined. In the early years of our marriage, I slowly, shamefully distanced myself from Clara to keep the peace at home. Seeing her name now filled me with a sharp pang of regret. On an impulse I didn't fully understand, I looked her up online. I found she was a potter, living just 2 towns over, running a small studio. Her website showed a woman with the same fiery eyes I remembered, though now framed by laugh lines and strands of silver in her wild, dark hair. My heart pounded as I dialed her number. I was terrified she would hang up, that the chasm of 35 years was too wide to cross. When she answered, her voice was exactly as I remembered it, warm and a little husky. "Clara?" I said, my own voice a reedy whisper. There was a pause. "Eleanor? Eleanor Vance? Is that really you?" The sound of my name, spoken with such genuine shock and warmth, broke something open inside me. The tears I hadn't been able to shed on the night Richard kicked me out came rushing to the surface. I told her everything. The whole sordid, humiliating story poured out of me in a torrent of words. She didn't interrupt. She just listened, a quiet hum of sympathy on the other end of the line. When I was finished, her response wasn't pity. It was pure, unfiltered rage. "That sanctimonious, silver-spooned peacock," she seethed, and I let out a watery laugh, the first real laugh in months. "You get in your car and you come here right now," she commanded. "I'm putting the kettle on." Walking into Clara's home was like stepping into another world. It was a riot of color and life. Paintings covered the walls, half-finished pottery projects sat on every surface, and the air smelled of clay, turpentine, and fresh-baked bread. It was messy and chaotic and utterly wonderful. It was everything my former home was not. Clara hugged me fiercely, and in her arms I felt the last of my brittle composure crumble. We talked for hours, catching up on decades of lost time. I told her about Sarah, my career, my quiet life. And then I told her about Eliza Bloom. I confessed my secret life as a writer, expecting her to be surprised. Instead, she just nodded, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Of course," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "I always knew there was a poet hiding inside that sensible cardigan, Ellie. He just never let her out to play." That visit was a turning point. I started seeing Clara regularly. We'd have dinner, go for walks, or I'd just sit in her studio reading while she worked at her potter's wheel. She reintroduced me to myself. She reminded me of the girl I used to be, the one who loved art and poetry, the one who wasn't afraid to have an opinion. She saw me not as Richard's discarded wife, but as Eleanor. Just Eleanor. And with her help, I began to see myself that way too. Meanwhile, my agent for Eliza Bloom had been trying to reach me. The forwarded mail eventually found its way to my new post office box. A film studio was interested in optioning my first series of books. The offer was staggering. It was more money than Richard and I had ever had in our joint accounts, even at the height of his career. I sat at my little wooden table, staring at the contract, and felt a strange sense of detachment. The money was wonderful, of course. It was security. It was power. But it wasn't the point anymore. The true treasure wasn't the number on the page. It was the quiet confidence that was slowly taking root in my heart. It was the realization that I had built this all by myself in the dark. And now I was finally ready to step into the light. I signed the contract, not as a final revenge against Richard, but as the first official act of my new life. A life I was building from the ground up, on a foundation of my own making. Life in Oak Haven settled into a peaceful, productive rhythm. I started writing again, not in secret late at night, but in the bright morning sun that streamed through my apartment window, the words flowed more easily now, unburdened by the fear of discovery or ridicule. The next Eliza Bloom book was taking shape, a story about a little bird who gets pushed out of its nest and must learn to fly on its own. The metaphor was not lost on me. My days were filled with simple, profound joys, the companionship of Clara, the satisfaction of my work, the quiet anonymity of my new town. I was healing. One crisp autumn afternoon, about 6 months after I'd left Maple Creek, I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go, but something made me answer. Eleanor? The voice was hesitant, strained. It was Richard. The sound of it sent a jolt through my body, a phantom limb of a past life aching. He sounded terrible. His usual booming confidence was gone, replaced by a thin, reedy desperation. Eleanor, I need to see you. We need to talk. I was silent for a long moment, my mind racing. Why now? What could he possibly want? Curiosity and perhaps a foolish, lingering shred of my old self made me agree. We arranged to meet at a neutral location, a small cafe in a town halfway between Oak Haven and Maple Creek. As I drove there, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I wasn't the same woman who had stood on his porch in the rain. I was no longer afraid of him. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at a small corner table. He looked older. The impeccably tailored suit he wore seemed to hang off his frame, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He stood up awkwardly as I approached. He tried to smile, but it was a grimace. "You look, well, Eleanor," he said, his eyes scanning me with a look of disbelief. I suppose I did. I had lost the stressed weight I'd carried for years, and Clara insisted that the new flecks of gray in my hair were distinguished. I wore a simple, comfortable dress, not the formal constricting clothes he always preferred. He stumbled through small talk, asking about things he'd never cared about before. It was agonizing. Finally, he got to the point. His business had taken a downturn. He had made some bad investments, confident that my salary would always be there as a safety net. Without it, his carefully constructed financial world was collapsing. He was in danger of losing the house. The house. He said the words as if they were a sacred relic. "I was a fool, Eleanor," he said, his voice cracking with a performance of emotion. "I was stressed. I wasn't thinking clearly. I miss you. I miss us. Our home isn't the same without you." He reached across the table, trying to take my hand, but I pulled it away. I just looked at him, my gaze level and clear. I saw him for what he was, a weak man terrified of losing his status. His apology wasn't about me. It was about his mortgage, his reputation, his comfort. He wasn't sorry for breaking my heart. He was sorry for breaking his bank account. "The house was never the same after you packed my suitcase, Richard," I said, my voice steady. It was then that he played his final card. He pulled a letter from his jacket pocket and slid it across the table. It was from my publisher, forwarded from the old address. A royalty statement. He must have opened it. His eyes were wide now, a desperate, greedy light in them. "Eliza Bloom," he whispered, the name sounding foreign and absurd on his lips. I had no idea. All this time, Eleanor, this changes everything. This is incredible. We're rich. We can fix everything. He was beaming, a grotesque, triumphant smile spreading across his haggard face. The use of the word "we" was like a slap in the face. I finally understood. Someone, a nosy neighbor perhaps, must have told him I was living comfortably. He'd probably assumed I'd found another man, another protector. But this was beyond his wildest imagination. He didn't see a woman who had built a career through her own talent. He saw a winning lottery ticket he had foolishly thrown in the trash. The clarity was blinding. He had never seen me at all. He had only ever seen a reflection of his own needs. I gently pushed the statement back towards him. "No, Richard," I said softly, but with a firmness that came from a place so deep inside me, it was unshakable. "It doesn't change everything. It changes nothing. That money is mine. The life I have now is mine. There is no we. There hasn't been for a very long time." I stood up, leaving my untouched cup of tea on the table. The look on his face was a mixture of utter shock and dawning horror, as if he was only just realizing the true scale of what he had lost. It wasn't just the money. It was the last desperate chance to reclaim the life he had so carelessly destroyed. "Goodbye, Richard," I said. And as I walked out of the cafe and into the bright, clear sunshine, I didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. The drive back to Oak Haven felt different. The air in the car seemed lighter, cleaner. The final conversation with Richard hadn't been a moment of triumph or revenge. It was simpler than that. It was a closing of a door, a final, quiet click. I had walked into that cafe carrying the last vestiges of a 40-year-old ghost, and I had walked out as just myself, Eleanor, whole and unburdened. The sadness was still there, a faint scar on my heart for the young woman who had invested so much hope into a love that was ultimately conditional. But it was no longer a gaping wound. It was a part of my story, not the entirety of it. When I got back to my apartment, I called my daughter Sarah. I had been putting it off, ashamed of the circumstances of my departure from Maple Creek. But now, the shame was gone. I told her everything, from the day Richard asked me to leave, to the secret of Eliza Bloom, to the final, pathetic meeting in the cafe. She was silent for a long time, and I feared I had overwhelmed her. But then she spoke, her voice thick with a mixture of fury at her father and a fierce, soaring pride for me. "Mom," she said, her voice breaking slightly, "I always knew you were magic. He just never learned how to see it." Her words were a balm, healing a part of me I didn't even know was still hurting. We made plans for her to visit, not to rescue me, but to celebrate with me. The film option for the Eliza Bloom books went through, and the influx of money was almost comical in its scale. For years, I had meticulously budgeted, carefully managing a household on 2 modest incomes. Now I was looking at a bank balance with more zeros than I could properly comprehend. But the strangest thing was how little it changed my day-to-day life. I didn't want a mansion or a fancy car. I had already discovered what made me happy, and it had nothing to do with Richard's vision of success. What I wanted was a home for stories. An idea had been taking root in my mind for months, and now I had the means to make it a reality. The little bookstore downstairs from my apartment, the Oak Haven Book Nook, was run by a lovely elderly couple who were ready to retire. I approached them with an offer. I didn't just want to buy their business. I wanted to expand it, to transform it into the kind of place I had always dreamed of. The next year was a whirlwind of joyful work. With Clara's artistic eye and my quiet, methodical planning, we redesigned the space. We knocked down a wall, installed comfortable armchairs, and built a small cafe in the back that served the best coffee and pastries in town. We built a beautiful children's corner with a mural of a magical forest from one of Eliza Bloom's books painted on the wall. I named it The Next Chapter. It felt right. The store became the heart of the community. I hosted story hours for children, started a book club for seniors, and held poetry readings for local authors. It was more than a business, it was a sanctuary. It was a place where people could connect, not over balance sheets and status, but over the shared love of a good story. I was working harder than I ever had in my life, but it never felt like work. It was a culmination of everything I was. The archivist who loved the history of words, the mother who loved to read to her child, and Eliza Bloom, the spinner of tales. Sometimes a tourist from Maple Creek would wander in and recognize me. They'd look at me with a mixture of pity and confusion, remembering me as Richard Vance's discarded wife. I would just smile, offer them a cup of coffee, and watch as their expression changed to one of dawning understanding. They were looking at a ghost, but I was a living, breathing woman who had authored her own happy ending. My fortune wasn't the money in the bank. I knew that now. The money was just the ink. My real fortune was the resilience I never knew I possessed. It was the rediscovered friendship with Clara, the renewed bond with my daughter, and the peace I found in a simple life lived on my own terms. It was the freedom to sit in my own cozy bookstore, surrounded by the stories of others, knowing that the very best one was the one I was still writing for myself. Richard had kicked me out because he thought my story was over, but in reality, he had just given me the chance to finally truly begin. The key felt cold in my palm. It wasn't the ornate, heavy brass key to our front door in Port Blossom, Oregon. This was my own car key, a small, insignificant piece of metal that had suddenly become the only key I had left in the world. Gregory had taken the house key from me. He hadn't snatched it, of course. His movements were always deliberate, measured, as if he were constantly aware of an invisible audience. He had held out his hand, his face a mask of regret so practiced it could have won him an award. "It's for the best, Amelia," he'd said, his voice the same soothing, reasonable tone he used on stage at town hall meetings. "A clean break. It will be less painful for both of us in the long run." The pain I felt in that moment was anything but clean. It was a messy, tearing agony that ripped through the very fabric of my 38-year marriage. It had all happened so fast. 3 weeks ago, I was Amelia Sterling, the head nurse at St. Jude's Coastal Hospital, a position I had held with pride for over 2 decades. I was Gregory's wife, a pillar of the community, the steady, reliable woman at the side of our ambitious city councilman. Then the hospital board announced a corporate merger. My department was streamlined. My job, my career, my entire professional identity was erased by a man in a suit from Portland who had never even met me. I was 60 years old. In the blink of an eye, I had become obsolete. At first, Gregory had been sympathetic, patting my hand and assuring me that we would weather this storm together. But as the days turned into weeks, his sympathy curdled into something else. Annoyance, impatience, and finally a cold, hard fear that was entirely for himself. His re-election was in 4 months, and his entire platform was built on fiscal responsibility and community strength. How would it look, he'd argued last night in a low, furious whisper, for his wife to be unemployed? "People will talk, Amelia. They'll see it as a weakness in my own house, a sign of instability." I had stared at him, dumbfounded. I wasn't his partner in life. I was a potential campaign liability. My personal crisis was nothing more than a political inconvenience. And so here I was, standing in the driveway of the beautiful Craftsman home I had painstakingly restored and filled with love. My car, a sensible 10-year-old sedan, was packed with 2 suitcases and 3 cardboard boxes. That was what my life had been reduced to. Inside those boxes were my nursing textbooks, a few photo albums, and the tools of my secret life, the one thing he had never seen, never valued, never even truly noticed. He thought I was leaving with nothing but the modest severance package from the hospital. He thought he was cutting loose a dead weight to save his own political skin. He had no idea that for the past 15 years, I had been building a lifeboat, a secret, glittering vessel of my own creation, while he sailed blissfully on in the ship of his own ego. He had no clue that the woman he was casting out was hiding a fortune that could buy our house 10 times over. As I put the car in reverse, the perfectly manicured garden, my garden, blurred through a sudden film of tears. He watched from the porch, not with sadness, but with the distinct look of a man who had just solved a very troublesome problem. The cottage was tucked away in a tiny, forgotten cove about an hour's drive south of Port Blossom. It was called Sea Spray Cottage, a name far more romantic than the reality. It was small and battered by years of salt and wind, with peeling paint and a roof that looked suspiciously patched. But it was all I could afford, and more importantly, it was available immediately. The real estate agent, a young woman with kind eyes, had looked at me with a touch of pity as she handed over the keys. I probably looked like a cliché to her, a woman of a certain age, suddenly alone, downsizing her life into a sad little box by the sea. I didn't correct her. Letting the world underestimate me had, in its own way, become my greatest strength. The first few days were a study in solitude. The silence here was different from the heavy, judgmental silence of my last weeks with Gregory. This was a wild, natural quiet, punctuated by the cry of gulls and the relentless rhythm of the waves crashing against the rocky shore just 100 feet from my door. At night, the wind howled around the eaves, a lonely, mournful sound that seemed to pull the loneliness right out of my own heart. I unpacked my boxes, arranging my life into the small space. I put the photo albums on a dusty shelf, my nursing books in a pile by a lumpy armchair. Then I opened the 3rd box. Inside, nestled in soft velvet cloths, were my tools: pliers, wires of silver and gold, delicate files, and a small jeweler's torch. And beneath them, carefully wrapped, were dozens of small pouches containing my treasures: luminous moonstones, fiery opals, sea-green tourmalines, and pearls that held the soft glow of a misty dawn. For 15 years, this had been my sanctuary. It began when our son Michael left for the army. The house felt so empty, and my hands, so used to caring for others, felt useless. I took a local jewelry-making class just for something to do, and I discovered a hidden talent, a deep, welling creativity I never knew I possessed. I started a small online shop under a different name, a name that felt more like the artist I was becoming, Cora Sands. Gregory had always dismissed it as my little hobby. He'd glance into my workroom, a converted sun porch he'd wanted for a home gym, and see me fiddling with beads. He never saw the hours of intricate work, the delicate dance of fire and metal, the artist's eye it took to pair the right stone with the right setting. He never knew that Cora Sands had slowly, quietly gained a following, first on small artisan sites, then from boutique owners in Seattle and San Francisco, and eventually from private collectors who paid thousands for a single one-of-a-kind piece. The money went into a separate bank account, managed through a P.O. box in another town. It was my secret garden, a world of beauty and success that was mine alone. Like my real garden back in Port Blossom, I had tended it, nurtured it, and watched it bloom, all without Gregory ever once bothering to look. Now, in this damp, chilly cottage, my secret world was my only lifeline. I set up a workbench by the main window which looked out over the churning gray expanse of the Pacific. The work was my salvation. As I shaped a piece of silver, hammering and filing and polishing, I poured all my grief and anger into the metal. When I set a stone, I was setting my own intention. To be strong, to be resilient, to survive. My hands, which had once soothed fevers and dressed wounds, were now creating objects of permanent, unyielding beauty. I was healing myself, one piece of jewelry at a time. I worked for hours, losing myself in the focused, meditative process. And when I would finally look up, the sun would be setting over the ocean, painting the sky in colors as brilliant and fiery as the opals in my hands. I was alone, but for the first time in a very long time, I was not lonely. I was too busy creating. The Oregon coast in winter is a raw, beautiful, and unforgiving place. The initial shock of my new life began to wear off, replaced by the simple, demanding reality of day-to-day survival. The cottage's old furnace was temperamental, the plumbing groaned in protest, and a persistent leak developed in the roof over the tiny kitchen. There were days when the sheer weight of it all, the physical and emotional isolation, felt like the perpetual gray sky, heavy and ready to collapse. I thought of calling my son, Michael, who was stationed in Germany. But his letters were filled with his own challenges, and the last thing I wanted was to be a source of worry for him. He believed the separation from his father was amicable, a mutual decision. The shame of the truth still kept my confession locked away. One particularly vicious storm blew in from the north, rattling the windows in their frames and sending waves crashing high up the shore. The next morning, I awoke to find that a large section of my rickety wooden porch railing had been torn away. I stood there, staring at the splintered wood, feeling a wave of utter helplessness wash over me. It was one thing too many, one more broken piece of a broken life. It was then that I met Sam. He lived a few coves down in a sturdier house that seemed to have been carved from the coastline itself. He was a retired fisherman, a man whose face was a roadmap of sea and sun, with kind, quiet eyes the color of the ocean on a calm day. He was walking his old golden retriever on the beach and saw me standing there, looking at the damage. He didn't offer platitudes or unwanted advice. He just ambled over, his dog sniffing at my boots, and looked at the broken railing with a critical eye. "Nasty blow last night," he said, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. "Got an old saw and some tools back at my place. I could give you a hand with that if you like." After my coffee. I was so taken aback by the simple, unconditional offer of help that I could only nod. An hour later, he was back, and we spent the rest of the morning working together, measuring, sawing, and hammering. He was a man of few words, but his presence was steady and comforting. He didn't ask about my past or why I was living alone in this rundown cottage. He just treated me as a neighbor, a fellow human being in need of a small kindness. That simple act of mending the porch became a turning point. Sam became a quiet fixture in my new life. He'd leave a fresh caught crab on my doorstep some mornings, or I'd share a pot of the strong coffee I brewed while working. We'd sometimes sit on the newly repaired porch, watching the waves, speaking little but sharing a comfortable silence that was the complete opposite of the one I'd shared with Gregory. Sam saw my workbench through the window, saw the intense focus on my face as I worked. One day, he gestured towards it. "You make pretty things," he said simply. There was no dismissal in his tone, no condescension. It was a statement of fact, an observation of value. Coming from him, it meant more than any praise Gregory had ever given me for a perfectly hosted dinner party. With this newfound sense of stability, I poured even more of myself into Khorasan's. My designs grew bolder, more organic, inspired by the rugged coastline around me. I created a necklace that mimicked the flow of water over stones, a pair of earrings shaped like sea-worn shells, a ring that held an opal that flashed with all the colors of a stormy sunset. My work was featured on a prominent jewelry blog, and suddenly the orders flooded in. A high-end gallery in Seattle contacted me, wanting to feature my work in an exclusive exhibition. The offer was significant, not just financially, but professionally. It would mean taking Khorasan's from an anonymous online presence into the real world. It was terrifying, and it was exhilarating. I used a portion of my savings, my real savings, to hire a local contractor to properly fix the roof and install a new reliable furnace in the cottage. I bought a comfortable bed. I was no longer just surviving, I was building. This little cottage wasn't a place of exile anymore. It was becoming my fortress, my sanctuary, my home, and I was building it myself with my own 2 hands and with the fortune no one else could see. The exhibition in Seattle was a resounding success. I attended the opening night, not as the creator, but as an anonymous observer. I stood in the corner of the sleek, brightly lit gallery, watching people admire the pieces I had made on my simple wooden bench overlooking the ocean. They spoke in hushed, reverent tones about the artistry, the unique vision of the mysterious Khorasan's. A well-dressed woman, her wrist glittering with diamonds, held up my storm-tossed pearl necklace to her throat and told her friend, "It feels alive, doesn't it? As if it has a soul." In that moment, I felt a sense of validation so profound it almost brought me to my knees. It wasn't about the price tags, which were staggering. It was about being seen. My soul, my story, my secret self was being seen and celebrated. The press from the event was significant. A magazine did a feature on the enigmatic Khorasan's, speculating about the identity of the artist whose work was taking the artisan jewelry world by storm. The article was syndicated online and picked up by smaller local news outlets, and that was how, inevitably, the news found its way back to Port Blossom. It was a crisp spring afternoon when I saw his car pull into my gravel driveway. Gregory. My heart didn't leap with fear or flutter with old affection. It simply stilled like the calm sea before a storm. He got out of his polished sedan, looking completely out of place against the backdrop of my wild, unkempt garden. He had lost weight, and his expensive suit seemed to sag on his shoulders. He was wearing his politician smile, but it didn't reach his tired, desperate eyes. "Amelia," he said, his voice oozing a forced warmth that made my skin crawl. "I've been so worried. I had to hire someone to find you. You look wonderful." He looked around at the cottage, at the new roof, the repaired porch, the smoke curling from the chimney. His brow furrowed in confusion. This wasn't the picture of destitution he had clearly been expecting. "You've landed on your feet," he said, a note of surprise and perhaps disappointment in his voice. I didn't invite him in. I simply stood on my porch, my arms crossed, waiting. "My campaign, it's not going well," he admitted, the charming facade finally cracking. "People are talking. They're saying I was cruel to you. My opponent is using it against me. It seems our little town values loyalty more than I anticipated." There it was. He hadn't come out of concern for me. He had come because his polls were down. He had come because the political liability he thought he had shed had come back to bite him. "That sounds like a personal problem, Gregory," I said, my voice as calm and cool as a sea stone. Frustration flashed across his face. He changed tactics, his voice softening, becoming pleading. "Amelia, I was wrong. I was a fool. I was under so much pressure. I've missed you. The house is empty. My life is empty without you." He took a step closer, reaching for my hand. It was then that Sam's old truck rumbled up the drive. He was dropping off some firewood for me. He got out, gave Gregory a long, neutral look, and then nodded at me. "Everything all right here, Amelia?" he asked quietly. The simple, protective question hung in the air. Gregory's eyes narrowed, taking in the easy familiarity between us. He saw Sam not as a friend, but as a replacement, and his ego couldn't handle it. "Who is this?" he demanded, his voice sharp with accusation. Before I could answer, his eyes caught something through my workshop window. A new piece I was working on, a breathtaking cuff of silver and aquamarine, was gleaming on the workbench. He stared at it, and then his gaze darted around my property again, a frantic calculation happening behind his eyes. The new roof, the well-maintained cottage, the expensive piece of art in the window. It didn't add up. And then I saw the dawning, sickening realization on his face. He looked from the bracelet back to me, his mouth slightly agape. Cora Sands, he breathed, the name a stunned whisper. The article, a reclusive artisan on the Oregon coast. My God, it's you! The silence that followed his revelation was thick with the weight of 15 years of secrets. He stared at me, not with admiration for my talent, but with the wide-eyed, frantic look of a man who had just discovered he'd thrown away a winning lottery ticket. His mind was clearly reeling, trying to process the magnitude of his miscalculation. The quiet, hobby-obsessed wife he had dismissed as a financial burden was, in fact, an artistic and commercial powerhouse. The fiddling with beads had built an empire he knew nothing about. "Amelia, we need to talk," he said, his voice shifting again, becoming urgent and conspiratorial. He glanced at Sam, who was still standing quietly by his truck, a silent guardian. Privately, I shook my head. There's nothing left to say. Gregory. And Sam is my friend. The word friend seemed to sting him. He ignored Sam and pressed on, his desperation making him reckless. "This changes everything," he hissed, his voice a low, excited whisper. "Don't you see? We can fix this. Your success, it's the perfect story." Local councilman's wife revealed as famed artist. "It's brilliant. It will save the campaign. We can tell them we planned this all along, that you needed the solitude for your art. We can get the house back. Everything." The audacity of it was breathtaking. The ease with which he tried to co-opt my life's secret work, my private triumph, and spin it into a tool for his own political gain. He didn't say, "I'm so proud of you." He didn't say, "I'm so sorry I never saw this in you." He said, "We can fix this." His world was so small, so completely centered on himself, that he couldn't even conceive of a reality where my success wasn't somehow ultimately about him. He saw my hard-won independence not as my victory, but as his salvation. I finally laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. It was a hollow, weary laugh that came from a place of deep, final disillusionment. "We?" I asked, my voice devoid of any emotion except a profound finality. "There is no we, Gregory. You made sure of that when you took my key. You dissolved we when you decided I was a liability." I looked over at my little cottage, at the sturdy porch and the solid roof, at the warm light glowing from my workshop window. This is my home now. I built it. The life I have here, I built it. Cora Sands. She was born in the quiet corners of a life where I felt invisible to you. She doesn't belong to you. Her success is not yours to claim. He looked utterly defeated, the last of his manipulative energy draining away, leaving behind a gray, hollowed-out man. He finally saw the truth. There was no path back. There was nothing he could offer me, because the things I now valued, peace, friendship, self-worth, creative freedom, were things he had never been able to give me and couldn't even understand. He saw the money, the fame, the opportunity. He couldn't see the fortune I had truly gained. He mumbled something that might have been an apology, but it was lost in the wind. He got back in his car, a man retreating from a world he no longer recognized, and drove away, leaving nothing behind but the faint smell of exhaust on the clean, salt air. When he was gone, Sam walked over. He didn't ask questions. He just picked up a piece of driftwood from the pile he'd brought and handed it to me. It was worn smooth by the ocean, its shape intricate and beautiful. "Thought you might be able to use this for something," he said. I took it from him, its weight solid and real in my hand. I looked from the piece of wood to the vast, endless ocean, and then back to the warm, inviting light of my own front door. Michael was coming to visit next month. I'd finally told him the whole truth, and his pride and love had been a wave of healing. The Seattle Gallery wanted to represent me exclusively. I was starting a new collection inspired by the colors of a coastal spring. My life was my own. Gregory hadn't kicked me out. He had, in his own selfish, short-sighted way, set me free. And my real fortune wasn't locked away in a bank account. It was all around me. It was in the quiet strength of a true friend, the love of my son, and the deep, abiding joy of creating beauty from the broken, weathered pieces of the world. The silence Gregory left in his wake was entirely different from the silence he had imposed on my life for decades. His departure didn't leave a vacuum, it created space. It was as if a great, suffocating weight had been lifted from the air, and for the first time, I could feel the gentle sea breeze on my own terms. I turned the piece of driftwood over and over in my hands. Sam was right. It was beautiful. Gnarled and scarred by its journey, bleached by the sun and polished by the relentless surf, it was a perfect testament to survival. It wasn't broken. It had been shaped. "He won't be back," Sam said, his voice quiet but certain. He wasn't looking at me, but out at the horizon where the sea and sky were melting into a soft gray line. "I know," I replied, and the truth of those 2 words settled into my bones with a profound sense of peace. There was no lingering hope, no painful ache of what might have been. The finality was a comfort, a clean, cauterized wound. I had looked into the face of my past, and I had felt nothing but a distant, clinical pity for the man he had become. A man so impoverished in spirit that he could stand in the presence of a real treasure and see only its monetary value. I invited Sam in for coffee, and we sat at my small kitchen table, the silence between us as warm and comfortable as the steam rising from our mugs. There was no need to dissect the encounter. He had understood everything he needed to know just by watching. He was a man accustomed to reading the weather in the sky, and he had read the storm in Gregory's eyes and the calm that followed in mine. 2 weeks later, my son Michael came to visit. He was on leave for a month before his next deployment, and the moment I saw him standing in my doorway, my breath caught in my chest. He was so tall, so strong, his face a younger, kinder echo of the man I had once loved. He looked around the small cottage, his eyes taking in the lumpy armchair, the patched roof, the general air of that what he must have considered humble hardship. I saw the worry in his expression, the protective instinct that every child feels for a parent they perceive as vulnerable. "Mom," he said, his voice gentle, "are you really okay here?" Dad said, "Well, he said you were struggling." I smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached my eyes. "Your father and I have very different definitions of the word struggling, Michael." I led him not to the sitting area, but to my workshop. I switched on the bright overhead lamp illuminating the pieces on my workbench. The silver and aquamarine cuff that had caught Gregory's eye, a pair of moonstone earrings that seemed to hold captured light, a pendant of fiery Mexican opal suspended in a nest of delicate gold wire. I watched his face as he took it all in. The confusion, the dawning curiosity, and then a slow, spreading wave of awe. He picked up the cuff, his large, capable hands surprisingly gentle. "You made this?" he whispered, tracing the intricate patterns. "Mom, this is art. It's incredible." I spent the next hour telling him everything. The whole secret history of Cora Sands, the years of quiet work on the sun porch, the building of a life he never knew I had. I showed him the bank statements, not to impress him, but to reassure him, to show him that I was not adrift, that I was the captain of my own, very well-provisioned ship. He sank into the armchair, shaking his head in disbelief. "All this time," he said, looking at me as if for the first time. "All this time, I thought you were just Mom. I never knew you were this person." He paused and his expression hardened slightly, and Dad never saw it. He lived in the same house with you for 38 years, and he never, ever saw you. It wasn't an accusation against me, but a final, damning judgment of his father. Later that week, we drove into the nearest town for supplies. As we were leaving the hardware store, Michael stopped by a newsstand. His own face was on the front page of the Port Blossom Chronicle, a photo from his last visit home, under the headline, "Local Hero Son Stands by Councilman Sterling." And right next to it was a smaller, more recent article, "Sterling Campaign Falters Amidst Personal Controversy." The story was vague, citing rumors of a messy separation and a growing perception of disloyalty. Gregory's carefully curated image was crumbling under the weight of one simple human truth he had failed to consider, that people notice when you discard a person who has stood by your side for nearly 4 decades. He had cast me out to avoid the appearance of weakness, and in doing so had revealed a weakness of character so profound it was destroying him. Michael just looked at the paper, then back at me. And in his eyes I saw not just love, but a deep, abiding respect. The approval of this good, kind man, my son, was worth more to me than all the gold in my workshop. The rest of his visit was a gift. We walked on the beach, we cooked simple meals, we talked for hours. I taught him how to solder a simple silver ring, and he laughed at his own clumsy attempts, his focus as intense as it would be on an army training exercise. He left me a photo of himself in his dress uniform, which I placed on my workbench, a constant smiling reminder of what truly mattered. My life settled into its new, beautiful rhythm. I began to know the other people who lived along my stretch of coast. A retired teacher who grew amazing tomatoes, a young couple who were trying to make a living as artists, and of course, Sam. Our friendship was a slow, sturdy thing, built on shared silences and small kindnesses. It was a companionship that asked for nothing and gave everything. I used some of the Khorasan's money to quietly fund a scholarship for nursing students at the local community college. An anonymous donation in honor of the dedicated women I had worked with for so many years. It was a way of connecting my new life with the best parts of my old one. One morning in early November, Sam brought over the newspaper with my coffee. There, on the front page of the Port Blossom Chronicle, was the election result. Gregory had lost. It wasn't even close. I looked at his photo, a strained, defeated image, and I felt a quiet, hollow sadness. Not for the loss of our life together, but for the man who had lost his own soul in the pursuit of an empty prize. His entire identity had been tied to his public image, and now that was gone. He had nothing left to polish. I folded the newspaper and placed it in the bin for the fire. His story was over. Mine was still being written. That evening, I sat on my porch, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, a cup of tea warming my hands. The sun was setting, and the sky was a breathtaking canvas of orange, pink, and violet, the colors reflected in the wet sand left behind by the receding tide. I thought about the word fortune. Gregory had seen it as a number in a bank account, a tool to be leveraged for power and status. He had no idea. My fortune was the salty air that filled my lungs, the steadfast friendship of a good man, and the fierce, unconditional love of my son. It was the joy of creating something beautiful with my own two hands, of watching an idea in my mind become a tangible reality. It was the peace that comes from knowing, with absolute certainty, who you are. My home wasn't the grand house in Port Blossom. It was this tiny, resilient cottage that had weathered 1,000 storms. My greatest treasure wasn't the opals and moonstones locked in their pouches. It was the quiet, unshakable strength I had found within my own heart. Gregory thought he was casting me into the wilderness, but he had only led me home.